So thanks for having me. It's excellent to be here. Let me just get right into it. Thank you for the kind introduction. So I'm going to be talking today about my book, which is that one. So what the book does is it looks at the programmatic transformations of four center-left parties with sort of an asterisk after the Democrats, because I do realize that the Democratic Party is not conventionally understood as a center-left party in the European sense. And it's a historical analysis of the programmatic transformations over the whole course of the 20th century. With the idea that one of the important things to understand about center-left politics is not just the policies that they pursue, but the actual language that they use, which is, of course, the language of representation. Sorry, I've lost my track already. The language of representation specifically of, ostensibly the language of representation of disadvantaged, working class, otherwise disempowered people who don't otherwise have the means to access politics except through representative institutions. So this is why I focus on these parties in particular. They're also important for different historical reasons. One of them having to do with, over the course of the 20th century, them being in different ways representative of major shifts in center-left politics from socialism to Keynesianism and then to neoliberalism or third-way politics toward the end of the period. So the book starts off with a look just at programmatic change, essentially, change in the language of center-left parties. And it started off with an analysis of the content of party programs. And this analysis is drawn from the manifestos data. And I published this in 2011 in Social Science History. And the argument that article makes, and this also appears in the early chapters of the book, is essentially that the big changes in politics and representative politics, especially in the neoliberal period, in the period after the 1980s, there's an emphasis on the politics of the right, the rise of Thatcher and Reagan, and neoconservatism in the 1980s. And so what I tried to do in this analysis of party programs was to develop an index of neoliberal emphases, essentially. So if and I had it in three, it's broken down into three programmatic categories, where if there's a shift, for instance, in welfare policy from protective kinds of safety net programs toward means-tested and programs that encourage work or workfare, as they call it, or if there is an emphasis on moving away from protectionism and emphasizing free trade and economic policy, or liberalizing finance, deregulation and privatization, the whole sort of repertoire of policies associated with neoliberal emphases, then if it's net positive in those kinds of emphases, then it's above the zero line here. So what this analysis shows, so this is actually 22 countries, center-left parties in 22 countries. And what it shows, or what the article argues, is that the major historical change especially the period since the 1970s, which are the bars in black, and this goes up to 2004, wasn't actually on the right. That is, in a certain sort of ahistorical sense, center-right parties were always neoliberal. They always emphasized free trade. They always emphasized work over welfare, relatively speaking. So what you can see here is they're always above the zero line, right, for essentially the entire post-war period. And so what you see then on the center-left is a more dramatic historical shift, essentially, where the programmatic emphases shift from being net negative, as a sort of anti-neoliberal. Again, that doesn't make sense really before the 1980s, but keeping that in mind, that then shifts, especially in the last about 20 years of this time period, toward being neoliberal, and that also in the literature on neoliberalism, third-way politics, there's an emphasis on on the Anglo-liberal countries, as in the Labour Party and the Democratic Party, being sort of the leading forces in this transition in third way politics. But what I show here is that actually it's more pronounced in other regimes, to use Esping Anderson's term. And this, keeping in mind also in this southern case, this only includes Italy for the whole period. So the argument that it makes is that the literature on the neoliberal period, on politics in the neoliberal period, is overly centered on the politics of the center-right, that actually the big historical transformation, the more decisive historical transformation, is on the center-left. And so it's something that needs to be analyzed and explained, and not only in the US or the UK, not only in Australia or other places where you don't have as deep histories of socialist politics, but also in the Nordic countries, for instance, with places with very strong socialist, social democratic traditions. So that is the motivating puzzle for the whole book. So the language underlying this, I then focus on these four parties that I've mentioned, the Swedish Social Democrats, the German Social Democrats, the Democratic Party in the US, and the Labour Party in the UK. And this rhetoric will be familiar to anyone who knows anything about third-way politics in the 1990s. There are some important differences in the way they speak, having to do with the history of the particular parties involved. But there's a common set of themes that emerges in the third-way period, which I summarize in the book as being a shared emphasis on the market, what works and what wins. In other words, a sort of trilogy of policy emphases having to do with working with markets, working around markets. This is a quote from the famous paper by Blair and Schroeder in 1998 on the third way, where they say the essential function of markets must be complemented and improved by political action, not hampered by it. So this is kind of a characteristic move in third way politics and third way programmatic rhetoric, where in prior periods there had been emphasis on managing, regulating, controlling markets or the economy in the interests of represented groups, in the interests of working people and middle class in particular. And one of the hallmark shifts then of third way politics is an emphasis on kind of conforming to what markets will allow, what markets demand, essentially. And then the other part of this characteristic trilogy, what works and what wins, is this sort of pragmatic language, this sort of pragmatic policy language of we'll try what the policies that work, or oftentimes the definition of what policies kind of work, which policies work, has to do with things like, for instance, in the case of welfare reform in the United States, has to do with getting people off of welfare, right? Which is also a kind of market-conforming form of social policy. And then an emphasis on this last item in the trilogy, what wins, where essentially proof of success, proof of representing the people who elect them effectively, proof of successful policy measures, is partly just in having won elections at all. So this is especially clear in the rhetoric of, for instance, Tony Blair, right, where he says he's in the late 1990s that New Labour is successful because it speaks to the people, and the fact that they stay in office is proof, right, that they're enacting the policies that people want. So this is probably not news to anyone, again, as I've said, people who know this period of politics, but what the book tries to do is it tries to get some historical perspective on this period in order to especially understand how you get this particular trilogy of emphases in the programmatic language of center-left parties. And there's an underlying concern here. The underlying concern has to do with what I've said before about left parties having special historical role in Western politics, or politics arguably anywhere, as representatives of the poor, disadvantaged, and marginalized. And that responsibility grows to the extent that inequality grows. And of course, we know the late 1990s was a period of rapidly accelerating inequality that has not, acceleration that hasn't quit since. And one could argue that turn of the 21st century third wayism failed to live up to this responsibility. That is the case that I make in the book. And I think that partly is just manifestly obvious at this point, given that in the wake of the financial crisis, there was no turn toward social democratic parties. It wasn't a time when the electorate turned to the parties that were supposed to represent people who were hit hardest. So the question is then, one of the problems with taking this on as an analytical object has to do with what are often the sort of hybrid investments of academics and social scientists, many of whom lean left and have some investment, a sort of personal investment in thinking about in being they're sympathetic with the politics of the center left. And so I had a certain frustration with literature on the third wave period, which had to do with the way that it would set up the problem or the question of third wave politics in terms of blame. The allocation of blame. Was it a betrayal of social democracy? Was it a historical failure? There's sort of a moral overtone to the literature on it. So how do you then back off of that kind of moral overtone and try to think analytically about this kind of historical transformation? So the approach that I adopt in the book is to try and get some historical perspective. So this is why it's about two reinventions, wherein the third way move is a final period that actually follows on the Keynesian period. So the dominant programmatic language that emerges in the third way period, this is the example of the SPD that's characteristic of all of the parties that I analyze in the book, is a shift from something, and it wasn't actually a shift from a predominantly socialist language. It was a sort of hybrid socialist language that was married to the technical language of Keynesian economics. Right. And so in the book, I call it economistic leftism. I call it that instead of Keynesian leftism, in part because, at least in the Swedish case, it didn't emerge from Keynes. But it was this similar kind of managerial language that you get in the language of all of these parties around 1960, in the mid-1960s, where the emphasis is on growth, prosperity, and it's this very technical, economistic kind of terminology, right? A just share for all in the national product, an emphasis on full employment, an emphasis on balancing fiscal and monetary policy, maintaining a stable currency, increasing productivity, all with the goal of increasing general prosperity. And there's this managerial language, which is instead of that kind of market-conforming way of talking in the third wave period, what you get in the Keynesian period is this way of talking about the economy as this thing that can be manipulated, adjusted, right? That you can strategically intervene, right, in the economy depending on your policy goals. So there's a very different way of thinking about the economic world in these two periods. And then this emerges out of something else, right? Especially in the case of the SPD, it's especially clear that the 1959 manifesto of the SPD was understood at the time as a break with its predecessor, which was, of course, the language of Marxian socialism. Right? And this is characteristic, except for the Democratic Party, which has a very different history. This is characteristic of the language of center-left parties in the early 1900s. It's more or less textbook Marxian way of thinking about the economic world. The economic world it's a capitalist economy. The primary concern of socialist politics has to do with representing the working class, the language of capitalists and the proletariat, right? And of course, the class struggle is the means of emancipation. So this kind of socialist language, even in the case of parties that in the literature are understood as more revisionist, so the Swedish Social Democratic Party, for instance, also uses this characteristic Marxian class language, right? Capitalism is the metaphor for the economic world. So what the book does is it tries to get some perspective on the third wave period by grounding it in its predecessor and understanding the whole trajectory of center-left politics, these two transitions from socialist politics to this language of managerial technical economics to the third wave period. So I do have in the book an analysis of why existing accounts of these transitions, especially the literature on the third wave period, aren't sufficient. So the rest of the talk will go like this. I'll get into especially the account that you get from the parties themselves, from people like Tony Blair, which is this is what the people wanted, right? This is the kinds of policies that people demanded. It was the only way to win elections. It was a response to voter demand. There are two other kinds of accounts that I consider in the book, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, if people are interested, but I won't dwell on in this presentation, and that is the argument that they had no choice. This is still the argument that third-way politicians will make, actually, in some of the presentations I've made to some third-way leaders in the Netherlands, actually, and it's precisely the argument that they're still making, which is that they had no choice. It was the globalizing world. There were certain demands that placed on them, and they simply couldn't do politics the way that they had done them. So that is the second dominant argument that I deal with in the book. The third one has to do with the thesis of union decline. Essentially, the unions were so weakened that center-left parties were sort of lost their working class roots and started speaking differently. So the argument in the book isn't that these arguments are wrong, it's that they're insufficient. And this has to do with the fact that the book is centered not on policies, but on language. Right? In other words, there's no direct link between globalization, right, or the or financialization, and the kind of language, the trilogy of themes that we saw, that was characteristic of third way period. So there's no sort of straight line you can draw between these kinds of forces and this characteristic trilogy of themes that you get in third way language. So in order to develop a different approach, I focused on parties. I have a whole sort of theoretical discussion of how we should think about parties, where the emphasis is on thinking of parties not as things that are pushed around or things that push other things, but rather they're these prisms that we should think of them, causal dynamics within parties, and with the metaphor of a prism. So I'll talk a bit about that. And out of that discussion of parties, I focus on particular people inside parties, the people who formulate programmatic language. And I call those people in the book party experts. And then I'll talk a little bit about these two reinventions that I've described, and then I'll wrap up. So on the existing account, I have a particular beef with this first one. Voters made them do it. Partly because it's an argument that people still make, that they essentially were just responding to what the people wanted. And so I'll focus on my beef with that particular account. So the voter demand thesis is essentially that that there was no other way to win, right? This was what electoral politics demanded of center-left parties. But looking at the case of the US in the 1990s, what you actually find is ongoing declines in voter turnout with a slight blip in 1992. The reason for the blip so the line maps voter turnout and the bars graph the percentage of the vote, the proportion of the vote going to the different parties. What you see in 1992 is a little blip, and this is the Clinton election, right? There's a little blip in voter turnout, but that has everything to do with Ross Perot's third-party candidacy, where he pulls an unprecedented 19% of the vote. So once that third-party element is removed, 1996, you actually get historical low, a 20th century historical low in voter turnout for presidential elections. So I think that's, it calls this argument into question by itself. The other thing that you see, the black bar at the very top, and in all the graphs that you'll see like this, the black bar at the very top represents third-party independent and, in the European cases, extreme party voting. The other thing that if you look at the congressional level, the other thing you see happening in the 1990s, and I've mapped this on two different y-axes in order to show that third-party independent voting in Congress has always been relatively low, but in the Clinton years and after Clinton, it actually reaches historic highs. And the other thing that you see in the 1990s, of course, is that there's kind of a trade-off. There's this trade-off that emerges between the Democratic occupation of the White House and Democratic power in Congress. It's actually in the 1990s that Democratic congressional dominance collapses after being dominant for all the post-war periods. Actually, under Clinton, that the Democrats lose Congress. And you see similar patterns in other countries. Obviously, in parliamentary systems, things look a little bit different. But the same kind of pattern of rising third-party vote or voting for parties other than the two dominant parties. The UK case is a little bit different because of a break-off from the Labour Party in the form of the SDP, but you get the same patterns in the 1990s where the rise of third-way politics within center-left parties comes along with declining voter turnout, and increasingly a turn toward, especially in the Swedish and the German cases, a turn toward far right and protest parties. So there's another story we could tell, which is a different story from what third way politicians told at the time, which is that what you actually got was a combination of the rise of third way politics, demobilization of people, all kinds of signs of disaffection and alienation from mainstream politics, or, and in combination with that, a return of far right parties, especially in continental, in Western Europe. And the more that those parties are dominant, the more voter turnout returns. And if we extended this up to the present period, the black bars at the top will get much wider. So I think this is good reason to doubt this argument that that this is what the voters wanted. So if that's not the case, then how do we understand what the parties are doing? Why do they adopt this politics? The approach that I take in the book is what I call a refraction approach. It has to do with this metaphor of the prism as a way of thinking about causality in analysis of political parties, where the basic argument is that parties are prisms and not pinballs. And this isn't rocket science. I have this nice image, but it's not a very theoretically complex way of thinking about the world. Within organizations, within any kind of social network, there's a process of interpretation, right? There's a process of interpretation. What is the electorate? What do they want? If they vote this way, what does it mean? It's written all over politics right now. This attempt to always kind of read what is really motivating the electorate is true with the economy. What does an economic crisis mean? If the problem is stagflation, what is the appropriate policy response? What are the causes of the problem? These things are all matters of interpretation. Inside party networks, there are people who do the work of interpreting. And if one then looks inside parties over in any time period, especially periods of economic crisis, what you see is not a consensual analysis of what the problem is and what's to be done about it. What you see is argument, contestation, disagreement, right? And a process by which some interpretation of the problem sort of rises to the surface and becomes the dominant account. But it doesn't happen automatically, right, in response to external events. And so this is the sense in which I think it's better to think about parties as prisms and not pinballs, and to focus especially on the particular people inside parties who maybe are elected politicians, who maybe have training in economics, who maybe have training as journalists or sociology for that matter, who do the work inside parties of generating analyses, interpretations of what's happening in the world and formulating a programmatic response to it. So the focus on this figure that I call a party expert isn't so much about credentials, it's not about the particular kinds of training or expertise they have, it's that their role inside parties is to do this work of interpretation. They're recognized as people who are qualified and authoritative on questions of interpretation. And so it's out of that you get programmatic language, out of these interpretive processes. And so if we want to understand why parties' programmatic language changes over time, the argument in the book is that we need to focus on contestation inside parties, there's a sort of interpretive contestation, and the role of figures that I call party experts. So for me, this then suggests a certain mode of historical analysis, which is partly historical comparative and partly focused on tracking the biographical trajectories of particular figures inside parties, to not take for granted, for instance, in the 1960s, that Keynesian economists would be the automatic authorities on questions of interpreting the economic world, and to instead try and understand how it is that people with those kinds of credentials, with credentials as economists, would become dominant in party networks at all. If you go back to the early 1900s and you look inside political parties, what you actually find is that the dominant economic experts inside center-left parties had no training whatsoever in anything that we would recognize as economics. So I start with these, I focus on these figures. In the European cases, I focus on finance ministers and their advisory networks. And this is grounded in a certain understanding of how party organizations work in Western Europe, that parliamentary organization, parties are sort of bureaucratic organizations that sort of have shadow governments, even if they're not in government, and there's somebody who's recognized as a main economic expert, and that figure is the one who would rotate into the position of finance minister if they were to win office. It's a little bit different in the case of the Democratic Party. It's much more loosely organized kind of institution, and there is no sort of government in waiting in a non-bureaucratic organization like the Democratic Party. So I focus on presidential advisory networks figures grounded, for instance, in the Roosevelt campaign, who then become economic advisors when the candidate wins office. The book uses a wide array of empirics, a range of archival material, secondary sources. In order to track biographical trajectories, I look also at memoirs and biographies, autobiographies. And the idea here is to try and ground those trajectories in larger institutional changes. To draw on historical comparative analysis, but to try and do it in the book, I use the term inside out, to try and see broad institutional changes from the perspective of people inside political parties. So there's sort of a methodological argument in here, which is that in a lot of historical work, there's a way in which individual actors will sort of appear on the stage, right? But they aren't situated, they aren't historicized, you don't understand how they come to be on the stage. And what they say, the things that get quoted are things that are sort of indicative of broader institutional changes, instead of being understood as things that express a particular worldview of historical persons. So the book makes an argument that we should be, in historical comparative work, we should be thinking about ways of using first-person accounts as explanatory instead of treating them as anecdotal or incidental. So that is the approach, and then I will get into summarizing how then we get these two reinventions, how we can understand it by focusing on this figure I call the party expert. And the general argument, causal argument of the book is that when you get new experts, you get people who have different kinds of professional ethics, who understand their role in politics in particular ways, and especially their role in terms of balancing the truth claims they make with navigating the political world. And when you get those figures dominant inside party networks, then you get programmatic reinventions, you get new leftism. So let's go back to those figures. Those figures in the 1920s, the first finance ministers in social democratic and labor governments. So this is Philip Snowden, Friedrich Thorsen, and Rudolf Hilferding. These are men in their times who are recognized as the preeminent economic authorities in their respective parties, in their respective countries. They're all born between the 1860s, the 1870s. They come of age along with and in the midst of the formation of socialist parties. They're all highly educated or more educated relative to the general population in their countries, which at this time it was extremely rare to have advanced degrees of any kind. But they had no formal training in economics. In no case were they university-based academics. They all established themselves as authorities on economic questions through involvements with socialist societies, clubs, associations, newspapers, and journals, and emerging party political circles. In other words, they entered into the position of dominant economic party expert in their respective worlds through socialist journalism. Oh, one thing I should say, as I've mentioned, I have the Democrats here crossed out here because there is no equivalent figure at this time in the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party comes into the analysis in the Keynesian period. So this is just a sampling of the kind of things I focus on in my biographical analyses of these figures in the book. And what I emphasize is that the way in which they become recognized as authoritative economic experts is through what is at the time called agitation, right? Where their job is to speak for socialism and to essentially socialize the electorate or the working classes into socialist ways of thinking about the world. And the way they do that is through socialist journalism in a context of party formation and democratization. So these figures are important historically for the history of the parties that I analyze in the book. They're also interesting if you contrast them with economists in their own time. They're contemporaries, and keeping in mind that economics was a very different profession at this time. They're contemporaries who were understood as economists and who were appointed in universities, were essentially either nonpartisan, as in explicitly kept a distance from any kind of party involvement, or if they were partisan, they were liberals or progressives. Right? And this was actually part of the sort of professional ethics of economics in all the countries I look at at this time, is that insofar as they are going to get involved in politics, if they do, they're connected to liberal parties. So Keynes famously was very much against socialist politics, wouldn't identify with the Labour Party, and was very active in the Liberal Party. And they had this characteristic way of thinking about the world, the economic world, as this sort of manipulable, machine-like thing that can be revved up, right? Or it can be, you can hit the brakes. That governments can rev them up and hit the brakes. So the economy is this manipulable entity. It doesn't function very well by itself. It needs management. And so what that means is that policymakers can and should use taxation or fiscal policy to soften recessions and support full employment. So there's this way of thinking, right, about the economic world, but these figures had no connection to some social democratic parties or center-left politics. If anything, they were actually opposed to what those parties stood for and understood, and they didn't understand themselves as, of course, people who spoke for the economic interests of the working classes. So the thing we should ask ourselves then is, how is it that you get a transition from figures like Hilferding, Thorson, and Snowden to Keynesian economists who think very much in this way about the economic world, who come to occupy exactly the same positions, who come to occupy positions of finance minister by the 1950s, 1960s. And this is true across the board. Now the American Democratic Party comes into the picture. So what you get here is a whole new generation of figures with strikingly similar trajectories, strikingly similar credentials, strikingly similar ways of thinking about the economic world, who become the foremost economic experts inside center-left parties. And so one of the things that is an important point of difference, of course, between these figures and the economists we saw in the last slide, figures like Keynes, is that they are deeply invested in the fortunes of social democratic parties, of center-left politics, and they understand themselves in these terms as people who are scientific economists. They bring scientific knowledge of the economic world into policymaking, but they're also deeply invested in the fortunes of social democratic and labor politics, labor parties. And this is true across the board. So I call this is a particular kind of professional ethic, which is dramatic. It's very different from the ethic of agitation. And I characterize it as a Keynesian ethic. So this is representative of the kind of worldview you get if you look at the memoirs of this generation of center-left economic experts. This is remembrance of Seymour Harris, one of the Democratic Keynesian experts in the Kennedy years. And he describes him after he passes having no children of his own. He made Harvard, the Democratic Party, Stevenson, and JFK, New England, and his students part of his extended family. So there's this hybridity of the positions of these figures where they have one foot in the academic world and one foot in the political world. And they're deeply invested in both. And what I argue in the book is that what you get out of that hybridity is a Keynesian ethic, a certain understanding of the responsibility of the economist in political life. So this is Walter Heller, the head of JFK's Council of Economic Advisors. And in the book, I compare how he describes his role in politics with Carl Schiller in Germany, partly because it should be surprising to us that they see things very similar ways despite being from very different institutional worlds. And they both talk about the world in this way, that what economists need to do in the world is they take for granted that government's job is to provide stability, to maximize employment, to help governments produce or maintain economic growth. And the economist's role in that is to bring science, scientific knowledge into the political world, and they're able to do that effectively to the extent that they're backed by professional consensus, by scientific consensus. They have the support of the professional orthodoxy within economics. And then in the political world, their job is to, this last part here, the economist must stay within the technical limits of his analysis while operating deep in the heart of realism. In other words, the economist's job is to bring scientific knowledge into the political world, but to adapt it to the necessities of politics, essentially. Adapt it to the strategic needs of center-left parties. Center-left parties have to be able to bring together unions and employers, and the economist's job is to provide them with advice that allows them to make strategic decisions that can adapt to those requirements. So in the book, I call that Keynesian ethic, and I characterize it in these terms. Economists help government manage markets in scientifically grounded and strategically practical ways. So we can contrast this with the ethics of everyone's favorite neoliberal economist, Mr. Friedman. So here's a quote from Friedman in 1962. The role of the market is that it permits unanimity without conformity. It's a system of effectively proportional representation. The wider the range of activities covered by the market, the fewer are the issues on which explicitly political decisions are required. Policy should be adjusted to the automatic pilot of the price system, that is, the market system. Now, this should look familiar to you if you think back to the trilogy of emphases in third-wave politics, this idea that actually the market is this thing out there. It's like the sun. We just have to deal with what it does, right? It's a force of nature. So what is the role of the economist in politics in the Friedmanite view? I characterize that way of seeing things as a neoliberal ethic. Economists limit politics in order to set markets free, right? Market-conforming politics. So you might be thinking, yes, but Stephanie, Milton Friedman was a Republican, right? He was associated with Nixon, he was associated with Reagan, right? How do you get then this kind of ethic in center-left parties and center-left politics? It's a good question. I have an answer. So what I trace in the book is partly the process of the formation of the neoliberal project. This is a story that we all know very well, the establishment of the Mont Pelerin Society, the rise of the remaking of the University of Chicago's economics and law departments. We know the story, I assume, also of the rise of free market think tanks. This shows the rise of one free market network of free market think tanks globally, everywhere but the Middle East, actually, for the whole post-war period up to 2005. The proliferation of think tanks, also organizations that are explicitly affiliated or become affiliated with center-right parties. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, the association of figures who are prominent at Chicago or prominent in the economics profession on the sort of neoliberal side of things, and economists based in free market think tanks and high-profile center-right or conservative politicians. So these are actually alliances that form an opposition to the kind of economic thinking and the kind of politics that, of course, is dominant in center-left, in Keynesian center-left politics at the time. And they're explicitly allied with, as I've said, parties of the right. So how then does this have consequences for what happens on the left? And this is the argument I make in the book, that what happens when you get what the Keynesian period and the rise of Keynesian economists inside center-left parties in the 1960s is symptomatic of is interdependence, a new interdependence between professional economics and center-left politics. What that means, if you want to intervene or alter center-left politics in some ways, there's actually two avenues of entry. One is through parties and one is through the economics profession. And so what I emphasize in the book is that what also happens alongside the making of the neoliberal project is the politicization of economics, of the profession itself, a new opposition between what was once understood, Friedman was understood even as late as the early 1970s as sort of a quack, well not quack, but a sort of unorthodox economist with extreme views. But inside economics, what the neoliberal project does is it politicizes the profession so that that professional consensus that Heller describes as necessary essentially fractures and disappears. So I track the politicization of economics. What I'm tracking here in the United States is in media, the process by which in political discussions, instead of getting economists in political discussions, you start getting either liberal or conservative economists or Democratic or Republican economists. They acquire these modifiers. And that's what this shows here, is that the rise of the use of these modifiers where economists are no longer sort of apolitical public intellectuals. There's also a process of response on the center left to the rise of free market think tanks. It's a much smaller network, but there's a new set of progressive and third way kinds of think tanks that emerge at this in response. I call this mimetic response to the rise of free market think tanks, or sort of counterpart research organizations. And then inside economics, this last point here, this is a quote from Lucas and Sargent, where they essentially announce in 1979 that you cannot be a Keynesian economist anymore in the style that Heller was, and still be understood, recognized as scientific, as a scientific economist. Right, so this is what they're saying here. The central fact is that Keynesian policy recommendations have no sounder basis in a scientific sense than recommendations of non-Keynesian economists, or for that matter, non-economists. So this plays out inside economics, and as I said before, this matters for left parties if there's this interdependence, right, between the profession and the parties, which there is, of course, by the 1960s. So the argument that I make then is that what you get is a profession which has a long history of close relationship with center-left parties, right, that has this internal revolution. And what you get out of that is the making of new kinds of economists who are still affiliated, who are still invested in social democratic politics, who are still closely connected with the Democratic Party, but who see things in a very different way. So this is a process by which you get a new figure that does the work of interpreting geopolitical trouble, oil shocks, inflation, economic events in the 1970s. And what you have inside the economics profession is a sort of politicized and embattled world of Keynesian economists who are marginalized, especially by conservative governments. This is very clear in the German and the British case. And then within the profession, a shift toward institutional or financial institutions, international financial institutions, towards central banks, and questions is also the period of the rise of financial economics. And drawing especially on Marion Fourcade's work, there's a shift in the profession where it becomes more sort of transnational, global profession. Right? So what you get are new kinds of economists bearing new ethics. I call them neoliberal ethics, very similar to what you get from Friedman, who are still deeply involved and central to interpretive processes inside center-left parties. So I call them transnational finance-oriented economists, TFEs, to make that easier. And what I argue is that these economists essentially are speaking for the interests of markets. They become representatives of the interests of markets. And this creates a practical and strategic problem for left parties. Remember the Keynesian economist who's all about this sort of adaptive strategic advice, right? Allowing parties to respond to the demands of their constituencies. What you get in the 1990s in third way politics are economists who are primarily concerned with building and saving markets, working in the interests of markets. This is, I have several examples of this in the book, but one of the examples I focus on is the Mexican peso crisis in 1994 and 1995, where, remember, this is in the context of you have to balance the budget, we have to spend less on welfare, right? There's a general concern with fiscal discipline, but in that context, there's an incredible effort by Rubin, Greenspan, and Summers to allocate funds in order to save the peso, and the logic behind it is to save markets and also to maintain faith, essentially, in market liberalization and market-based reforms. So the argument in the book is that when you get this kind of new economist, this new kind of dominant economic expert in center-left parties, you have a strategic problem inside center-left parties, where essentially you no longer have a way of thinking about or critically analyzing the economic world in a way that you can strategically adapt to the demands of your constituencies. And so the argument that I make in the book is that there's actually a relationship between the rise of the TFE, who tends to think in terms of promoting and preserving markets, And a new kind of dominant expert, this is also the 90s, of course, is the period of the rise of the spin doctor, right, of political consultancies, people who specialize in winning for its own sake. So the argument in the book is that there's an elective affinity between the TFE and the spin doctor, which, if you think back to that trilogy of emphases, these are the figures behind the rhetoric around what wins. Right? So that essentially, the more you get market promoting and preserving policies like bailouts, social security reductions that are a tough sell for center-left parties, the more parties have to rely on experts that can mobilize constituencies or mobilize voters just enough to win. So this is the argument about the second reinvention, and I trace these processes. It doesn't play out the same way in all cases, but you do get this sort of characteristic, goes along with the trilogy of emphases, this characteristic trilogy of experts, where you get TFEs, the wonk, the think tank wonk, and specialists in strategic specialists or specialists in spin. So I will just say a couple concluding things. One is, to wrap up, there is a broader sort of field theoretic causal story about cross-field tensions and how they drive these processes of reinvention. In the 1920s, 1930s, I characterize those tensions in Polanyian terms as a time when it becomes clear that political elites can either respond to democratic demands or save the gold standard, but they can't do both. That what you get then by the 1960s is an interdependence between economics professions and center-left parties. And what that essentially does, if you want to be Freudian about it, sort of sublimates the economic demands through economics. And so the way I characterize the second reinvention, the causal forces behind it, I call it, well, not in the book, but I think I should have called it a Mannheimian kind of cross-field tension, where you get tensions between democratic demands and the interpretation of the economic world through the economics profession. And out of that, what you get are new party-expert relations, new experts who see the world in new ways, who have new professional ethics, and that's the basis of the rise of new leftisms in both the 60s and at the end of the 20th century. So this is the general story. That's just in the book. So essentially is a summary statement of what I just said. And there are a couple arguments that emerge out of it. One is methodological. The other is sort of has to do with what it means for contemporary politics. The methodological argument has to do with the problem of actorlessness in historical social science. Specific actors are treated in historical work. They often appear in historical work, but they're not situated. They're not historicized. They're not treated as explanatory. And yet the way we see the world expresses our position in it. It shapes how we act, and action shapes history. So in that sense, I think actorlessness in social science is a methodological problem that renders obscure the connections between position, perception, and social action. So that's my methodological argument, and then I have these broader arguments about what it all means. And I think there's a number of things that emerge out of the book, but one of the things has to do with what is the role of experts? How do we think about the role of experts in politics? And the argument that I make is that when experts intervene in politics, they represent things. They represent markets. They represent groups. They represent the interests of people. And it's possible for them to misrepresent, right? To distort representative politics rather than representing, in the case of center-left parties, the actual interests of people. And that one of the symptoms of this problem is the rise of the strategist. It isn't actually about economics at all. It's actually the rise of specialists in spin, that this is symptomatic of a period in which you have a sort of distorted or misrepresentative politics of the center-left. And then there's some argument that I think could be made. I don't do this in the book, but I'm sometimes asked, so what does it all mean for what kind of economics we need now? And I think one of the implications is that what we need is a progressive kind of economic expertise that uses people's experiences and understandings, not as anecdotes, not as things that should be eclipsed by grand abstractions, but rather as analytical starting points. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we're right at the 1 o'clock clock turnaround, so if anyone has to leave for one, now is a good chance to do it. Those who remain will begin the Q&A. Who wants to go first? Called Andrew.
This is really interesting. I like the call to bring actors back in. There's one actor who shows up on the slides we don't even talk about, who's Rex Tugwell. And I think Tugwell's really interesting because he is an economist. He starts at Columbia. He moves into the New Deal, where he's particularly prominent in the southern agencies, the TVA, the Conservation Service, the Resettlement Administration. And then in 1941, he's banished to Puerto Rico because he's so far left that FDR can't deal with him anymore. Right? The party can't deal with him anymore, in part because he's pissing off the whites in the Solid South. And I think this speaks to at least three issues. One is that who the experts are is itself endogenous to all the other political factors that are going on. They're not just people who swoop in out of nowhere, right? Secondly, economics itself needs, I think, not just an internalist account, but an externalist account. It's as much a product as a producer of these political changes. And then the third thing is, I worry a little bit that in framing the Democratic Party as a sort of left party, and you're clearly sensitive to this, there's a nostalgia. Because what we forget is in the high water era of this, left, Democratic Party, it's rooted in an incredibly racist, bifurcated structure. And that leads to an alternative account of the downfall of the Democratic Party in the 70s and 1980s, which is when finally the civil rights movement comes along and says, you have to take the African American community seriously. You can't maintain this BS coalition anymore. And that's a very different account of what's going on here than your account. And we don't hear anything about that here.
So I do deal with that in the book. There are a number of things that one can't get into even an overly long presentation on an overly long book. And I do talk about the relationship between the politics of race within the Democratic Party after the 1960s and the rise of the DLC. This partly emerges out of interviews and their own accounts, and where there's the rise of DLC is specifically in opposition to the far left within the party, to the sort of to what they call the fringe, right? Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition, right? So in the way they talk about how we're going to resuscitate the Democratic Party, how we're going to come back to the middle class, their idea of the middle class is a white man. That is the image that they very clearly have, and the fringe is anybody who is not a white man. So essentially the vast majority of the voting population is the fringe in their imagination. And you see this now in democratic politics too, right? We have to appeal to the center, who's in the center, right? It's essentially the same kind of thinking. So that's deeply overlaid with race. But I do have a concern with, in the book, this emphasis on taking actors' accounts as real expressions of their understanding of the world. They didn't understand it as a racist project. They understood it as we're here to save the party in order to be able to continue representing the interests of the fringe, right? Of black people and of women, and so they understood themselves. And to me, this raises important analytical explanatory questions. They understood themselves as explicitly working in the interests of those groups that within the party they were also actively marginalizing.
You mean in the 80s?
Yes, in the 1980s. But that's there's a whole there was analysis of how the Democratic Party sort of absorbs the civil rights movements, but then also becomes a more national organization. One of the things that the DLC does is it shifts power in the party toward the superdelegates, toward people who are already kind of establishment Democratic politicians. So what they essentially do, or my analysis of it, is that they sort of absorb those movements without actually giving them real power inside the party. They understand themselves to be doing that in the interests of working class and middle class people, which in historical perspective is questionable to say the least.
Just a quick thought, and I'm just going to jump in. Something that's perhaps one of the reasons the Democrats fit but don't quite fit, and this, I don't think this is in the book, and I just thought of it in response to what you were saying, is the Democrats are obsessed with the self-nostalgia. Right? They're always trying to recover something. And you don't get that with the SPD. I mean, it's not as if the SPD ever sits around and goes, we need to get back to bad Goodisberg, right? That just never happened, right? The Swedes don't even do that. And, they still have a reasonable, facsimile of the things that were built in the 30s and 40s. Labour certainly doesn't do this, right? So there's something peculiar about the Democrats in the fact that like every generation is trying to get back to something that it was before, which is this fictive imaginary that it never was.
Well, and
It's very odd, isn't it?
I have a theory of why that is, which has to do partly with it's sort of to some extent an organizational side effect. The Democratic Party has no archive. There is no such thing as a Democratic Party archive. There is, it was much easier in some ways to do the other cases
Right.
because there is such a deep and detailed historical literature on the history of the SPD, right, or the Labour Party, and that has to do with the existence of an archive.
Right.
If you call the DNC and say, "I'd like to get into your archive," they will say, "What archive?"
But that's
doesn't exist.
endogenous too,
Yes.
right? They don't want to remember just
Right.
how awful things were in the 1940s when they were shafting people in Tennessee.
I think some of them don't want to remember, but I also think what it means is that leading figures in the Democratic Party think of the party in this sort of mythological terms, in terms of the sort of history of these great figures, right? Where we're gonna take a little bit from FDR, and we're gonna take a little bit from Andrew Jackson, and it's sort of this like. They essentially operate on the basis of a mythology. But I think it would be very difficult for them to do that if there was an archive and there really was an in-depth.
Official historian, for example.
And people within the party, people within the Labour Party know the history
Right.
of the organization. They're.
I don't know if I've ever told you the story. Sorry for monopolising this, but just I'm on a roll. In 1993, the Labour Party moved from what was called Transport House to its new location, which is close to Parliament. And I was in their archive, and John Smith had just died, right? So Tony Blair, in 94, Tony Blair had taken over, John Smith had died. And I said, where's all the economic policy documents that were done with John Smith? And he says, honestly, they're in a skip out the back, they were in a dumpster. Right? So basically, Blair's people had moved in and just took all the stuff off the shelf and put it in the dumpster, and were starting anew. And I said, so that's a bit of a sort of like, scratching the memory. And they're like, oh yeah, that's exactly what they're doing. They knew they were editing the archive.
Mm-hmm.
Smith was gone. It's now just basically, I get to be the continuity.
Right. Right. Yeah. And so, Democratic Party, you don't need to edit. You just retell the history of the party.
Right.
You construct a new mythology.
Questions?
I mean, I would argue that there is a certain nostalgia in the Swedish Labour Party as well, but that aside. So you mentioned the fact that there was like a non-Keynesian route in the Swedish party. I assume you mean Gunnar Myrdal, right? How do you explain that they still follow the same path as the rest of them?
Sorry, that the Swedish case follows the same trajectory?
Yeah, exactly. Or do you see that as like a proper break, or is it just another?
In the 20s and the 30s.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I track in that time period is the process by which, as parties like the Swedish Social Democratic Party were becoming dominant parties of politics and government, was the way in which what one of the organizational shifts that comes along with that process is that they start establishing essentially recruiting networks in universities and colleges and through associations and clubs and things like that. And it's explicitly in order to sort of recruit a next generation of economic experts, among other kinds of experts, right? University trained, future party leaders. And so with the Stockholm School, what's interesting and what's happening also in many other places, it's not just about party formation, it's also about discontent with the dominant economists, with their mentors, right, with their advisors, having essentially irrelevant analyses of the economic world at a time of massive unemployment and all kinds of economic unrest and labor movements and among many other concerns. And so there's a sort of generational struggle within economics that leads, because figures in the Stockholm School become connected actually to all the leadership of all the major parties in Sweden. There's now a direct route for the next, when the younger generation of economists kind of rebels against the older generation, they establish a direct route into the leadership of the Swedish Social Democratic Party or the other cases. So part of it, I think, what happens there is the reason they follow the same kind of path is because they're confronting the same kinds of economic problems, right? And mass unemployment is sort of a difficult problem to ignore. And they have they have an analysis which is sort of Keynesian before Keynes, right? What do you do when there's a collapse of that kind? Well, you start putting money into people's pockets, and you reboot the economy. I don't think you needed to be trained as you didn't need to be Keynes, right, to recognize that that was a logical answer to it. But they brought their own kind of specific angle to it, through Swedish economics. I guess what I'm saying is, sorry, this isn't the clearest answer I've ever given. What I'm saying is I think that economists or people were drawn into economics in this time because they were responding to relatively clear economic problems. They were, and once you established a connection between figures like Myrdal and the German Social Democratic Party, that then you have this kind of process of sort of intergenerational sort of replenishment, I guess, of economics in all the parties. But I think the causes, and this is why I call it this kind of Polanyian moment, is the basic cause of that across all the cases has to do with this clear world in which economic analysis and political leadership is not responding to democratic demands.
Thanks for the talk, very interesting. My question is about the non-experts within those parties. So how much do they know about economics, and to what extent they really need to depend on the advice of those, and does that dependency vary over time?
Right. Well, one of the way that I think about the party expert is that one of the things that's really interesting, for instance, in the case of, in the German case or in the case of the Labour Party in the UK, is that the dominant economic experts, they're economists and they're also party leaders. In other words, the category party expert isn't exclusive of the category politician. And so you have kind of, you have this fusion of these two roles. So one of the things that's interesting in the 1960s, if you look at how politicians in all these cases speak at that time, is they all kind of speak like Keynesian economists. They're very familiar. And that's partly because either they are Keynesian economists or trained as economists, or for instance, in the case of JFK, they're essentially educated in Keynesian economics by people like Gordon and Tobin. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I guess what I'm saying is in the 60s, or in this time period of when these figures are dominant, the category party expert actually overlaps with politician. They're not sort of mutually exclusive categories. I think those roles fracture by the time you get to the 1990s, where you have more specialized experts. You have the economists specialized in markets, the consultants specialized in elections, and then you have someone like Clinton who can kind of speak both of those languages, but isn't himself actually playing either of those specialized roles. But I see, I think parties have certain necessities, right? They have to have an analysis of the economic world. I think it's sort of a functional necessity, really. They have to have some kind of strategic analysis of how to win and stay in office, and they have to balance those necessities. So I think maybe the important thing in response to your question is that what you get in the 1920s is more sort of purely party politicians who become inside party organizations. They become recognized as economic experts. In the 1960s, you have a little bit of specialization where you have trained economic experts, but once they enter into party networks, they become both experts and politicians. What you see in the 90s is a more sort of specialization of different roles, I think, where you have, like I was saying, sort of experts on particular policy questions, right? You have experts on finance and international markets. You have experts on matters of strategy, right? And then you have politicians who are kind of, where the most successful politicians are able to kind of use these different forms of expertise to acquire authority or to become powerful in their worlds.
Next up.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that you have a slide about different actors within the party, like the strategists and the experts, and I'm wondering if you can talk more about like the sort of ideologues or most dogmatic people in the party when they, somebody who truly created some sort of ideological or normative atmosphere in a certain period of time when, like, let's say Keynesianism was really dominant within the field, and what comes to it then after a new knowledge comes into the field, and if there was really such a dominant ideological arena there, to what extent this organizational atmosphere was like torn down.
Are you specifically in the 60s or?
Well, any period, like any shift, like maybe two shifts, like from the very traditional socialist thinking and to Keynesian, from Keynesian thoughts to like neoliberal thoughts.
Right. Well, your question makes me think especially of the period in the 1920s and 1930s. One of the things that's so interesting about that period to me is that people like Hilferding, or even in the Swedish case, in the case of Fredrik Thorsen, they're pretty dogmatic, right? They're pretty ideological figures who interpret things, especially Hilferding is famous for this, right? Who interprets things in sort of a dogmatic Marxian sense. One of the things that I show at that time is that Hilferding is arguing with other economists who have very different, they're not Marxian economists, and they're specialized in statistics. They have a very different form of knowledge, a very different way of arguing, of making their case, who essentially proposed Keynesian policies before Keynes in the early 1930s. And so they're sort of, in that context, the sort of Marxian economist becomes the conservative. They're actually the fiscal conservatives. They're the ones who are arguing essentially for austerity and fiscal orthodoxy on kind of, you could call it an ideological basis, I suppose, but it's on the basis of a very different form of economic expertise. And so they're actually sort of responding, or Hilferding digs in as a response partly to this other form of economic expertise that's grounded in statistics and mathematical reasoning. So I'm not sure. I guess I'm a little uncomfortable with the term ideologists. I mean, they're not exactly. They're all kind of ideological in a way, but they have different investments, right? They have different ways of making their arguments about the realities of the economic world. And one gets the definite sense that figures like Hilferding were threatened, right? So Hilferding, for instance, had a long history of not allowing that kind of work to be published in his journal. So I think I don't use the term ideology very much in the book, because I think it's sort of it has a way of encouraging people to think about figures like Heller or Hilferding as people in the world, but then with these kind of ways of thinking that float above it. But I actually think the way that they thought was grounded in their perspective in the world and their investments, like all of us. Right? We see things in a way that tends to coincide with things that bolster our own authority, right? So I think that there are ideological currents in these parties for the whole period that I'm looking at, but there's contestation on the basis of threat of older generation people who have a certain way of understanding the world against younger generation people who are essentially saying your way of knowing the economic world is wrong, it's unscientific, right? And that happened in the transition from socialist economists and Marxian economists to Keynesian economists between the 20s and the 30s, right? And it happens in the transition from figures like Heller to figures like Larry Summers in the 1980s and 1990s. That these are essentially figures who they're not ideologists exactly, but they're opposed to each other on basic questions of epistemology, how you think about the economic world, how you analyze it, what is its reality. And there's an STS angle actually to this kind of argument, which is they're bringing different tools of measurement right? Statistical analysis is a very different tool of measurement than the tools of analysis that were used by Marxian economists in the 1920s. They didn't have, not only were there not widespread standardized economic statistics, but they also didn't make their arguments on the basis of those kinds of numbers, essentially. It was historical argumentation. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but I'm trying to avoid the category of ideology a little bit.
Sorry, would you say there was kind of some sort of organizational culture, like when certain dogma was very dominant, and then because your argument is because new thinking was infused in this field and new actors came in, and does that kind of would you use the term organizational culture of different periods in this party?
I think you could, but I think that in my way of thinking about it, organizational culture, or what could be called organizational culture, at least in the case of parties, what it tends to express is the worldview of the dominant faction within the party. So within, you look inside any political party at any time period, there's always, in the UK, there's the front benchers and the back benchers. There's always factionalism and opposition, right? There's always an alternative. So I would be hesitant, well, at least for my purposes, to understand the processes I want to understand. Organizational culture it acts as if parties are unitary things that sort of all think in one way. But actually the important thing that's driving historical change in my analysis is opposition within party networks, where dominant organizational culture happens to also be the way that dominant party leaders see the world and are in a position to marginalize people who don't see the world in that way. And part of that maybe has to do with their claims about what is true and possible in the economic moment they're in, but it also tends to dovetail with them maintaining power and staying in office.
So maybe a little bit of an odd question, but I'm wondering about recruitment methods in these parties as a potential subset to your explanation or an alternative explanation. Like if I think about the way American, the way you enter to the Democratic Party in America seems to be very different from some of the European ways of entering into the party.
Yeah.
If I think about my own country, like in Belgium, in the Socialist Party, there's a very well-established way of as a student you already get involved and you kind of grow within the party. And then compared and contrasting to that, the 90s also coincides with, even in my region, with new recruitment methods, what we call white rabbits, which is when they pick people from famous positions of other places to come into the left-wing party. And I'm kind of wondering whether those, what the influence of recruitment methods is, and whether that could also function as a way to explain why in the 90s something shifted, because people that maybe have been raised less with these grand ideas come in and set course differently.
So you mean recruitment sort of into party leadership or into the party and then up the ranks?
Yeah, and kind of how that works to grow up in the ranks of the party.
Right. Well, I think, so much, it's like everything goes back to the 60s, in some ways. And so, part of what happens in the second reinvention is, and this happens in a different way in the Democratic Party, we're talking about this in terms of sort of absorption, but also keeping at bay representatives of civil rights groups and inheritors of those movements. I think you see the same thing, the SPD, for instance, essentially lopping off its youth wing because it became too radical and basically closing leadership ranks to people who are associated with that. And then the figures who out of that generation, the 60s generation, who are able to become sort of elites in the party, they have to kind of compromise on those. They have to de-radicalize first. So I think there is, in terms of recruitment, the story of the second reinvention. Partly, I think there's a story of the party elites sort of pulling up their roots, right? And sort of there's still formal ways that there's still youth organizations and there's formal ways of entering the party, but the route from those organizations into party leadership, they start strangling those pathways. And I think that happens in different ways in all of the cases. Some more successfully, some less successfully. SPD was famously successful in that effort. And you see that then in the period in the 1990s, in the SPD case, in the opposition between Schroeder and Oscar Lafontaine, where one is sort of the moderate and one is the radical, and that kind of axis lives on, right? But it's a struggle amongst what you see in the 90s in all cases is these very dominant older generation party elites who essentially have closed ranks, I think one could argue. And the same thing was happening in the 1920s. It just, I think, because of the economic situation, all of the unrest and the importance of the labor movement and labor organizations inside, as the basis of labor parties and social democratic parties, they couldn't close those channels. Those were the parties, if that makes sense. There's maybe another thing to say, which is that the importance of the sort of globalization of the economics profession, where if you noticed in my last slide, you actually get this thing happening in Europe, which I try to sort of call into question. We should think this is strange, where you get American economists or U.S. trained economists or international economists at as in the formation of the ECB, becoming essentially dominant economic experts in their domestic context. So you get, it's in the 90s, I think, that there's not a single Swedish economics dissertation written in Swedish anymore. So there's this sort of globalization, transnationalization of the profession in this way that kind of leans heavily toward that treats the U.S. and American economics departments, and maybe secondarily British economics departments, as they're sort of the center, right? And so you have social democratic economists in the Swedish Social Democratic Party, but they do a very American kind of economics, and and their sort of prestige hierarchy is a global prestige hierarchy, if that makes sense. So I think in terms of specifically economic experts, you don't get someone like Snowden, who kind of moves up through the ranks and becomes an economic expert by moving through party ranks. You get instead global or internationally recognized economists who do a very American kind of economics, becoming.
If I just jump in there, I did a lot of work on the Swedish case at one point, and I interviewed some of the last remaining trade union economists at LO, and they have a story which is an adjunct to this, which is essentially when Assar Lindbeck goes mental in 1976 and says, "Fuck the SAP, I'm done with this." And he writes this paper which gets published in a big American journal that basically says all social democratic politicians are rent seekers. Right? And this causes this furore in this firestorm, and he's the enfant terrible of the moment, etc. And then when they sort of do the refounding of the party, the devaluation, they get back into power in 1981, he comes right back in at that point. And his condition of re-entry is the trade unions don't get in the door anymore. So basically it's me and my people get to tell you what economics is. Right? And that was that moment where you really got a shift in Sweden at that point in time. And so that's what Lindbeck kind of, that 5-year period, and it was a very bitter fight amongst economists within the party.
Yeah, that's essentially how I characterize the Swedish case, is that really what you get is sort of economists versus economists within social democratic ranks.
Right.
And a displacement
and
of...
who gets to say they're an economist?
Right, exactly.
So the irony is, in the Swedish case, the whole success of the post-war model was this supply-side Rennmeidner, wage compression, active labour market policy, etc. And Lindbeck comes along and basically says, yeah, well, I know that worked, but I'm going to pretend it's a problem. And that was basically his move. And it was all about getting control of the party away from the unions.
So if the trade unions had been as strong as they'd been 2 decades earlier, he never would have gotten away with it. Right?
Yeah,
they
were still quite strong.
It's the same as in the U.S. The Democrats would never have had the economists they had in the 1980s and 1990s if union density had been 30% of the labor force.
Yeah.
But Sweden is still, at that time, union density is still very high. It's declining, it's still very high, and there's a fracture between the white collar and the blue collar union. I think actually that might be more important in some ways. But the general story that the way I would characterize that is that it's not, and this is actually goes back to my argument against the union thesis, right? Is that it's not as much about the relative strength and numbers of unions. It has to do with the strength of the relationship between unions and center-left parties. In other words, you get this kind of It's very clear, like in the case of New Labour, the making of New Labour was all about eliminating the power of organized labor inside party ranks, right? And so it's about changing the voting system, right?
Individual membership, all that stuff.
Right, and that wasn't about union strength. It was about the maneuvering of party elites to try and essentially divorce the party from the labor movement.
I have a reaction to that, but I don't want to monopolize people. I mean, I think this is a dilemma with the prism argument, because you kind of can't have it both ways. You want to say, you know, the union story is not completely wrong, but, you know, at the same time, it's not everything. And what that means is you're kind of trying to, you know, when someone comes along and says, well, but the unions matter, and the trajectory matters, and all these other things matter, you say, oh no, that's my problem with the union story. Right? But then,
Well, no, the argument, so remember the book is an analysis of language. It's not an analysis of policies, and it's not an analysis. So no, I don't think there's a direct relationship between the decline of union strength and the classical third way trilogy of markets, what wins and what works. There's no line you can draw between those two things. There's some process that happens inside the party, right, that produces that language. And so, yes, it's important, the relationship between unions and the strength of unions and the parties, that's very important, right, for who wins the argument over how the world should be interpreted.
But
That
who
is very important.
disagrees with that?
But, sorry?
Who disagrees with that?
Well, I think a lot of the language, at least on the third way transition, conflates, the analyses of third way transition tend to conflate language and policy, right? They don't make a distinction, right, between the policies that a government in power pursues and the kind of language that the party uses in a campaign. I think they're not analytically distinct in a lot of literature on that period. I don't think.
Your better defense in the book is the following, which is that when you focus on the shift to TFEs, the particular form of economic knowledge basically says, okay, the whole purpose of the party is now different. We don't reform markets, we conform to markets. And once you conform to markets, labour's a factor input. It's not your particular constituency. So they could be strong, but it doesn't matter because you don't actually think you represent them as a special actor anymore. And that became completely clear when you had the Reuben Summers switch. Like they had nothing, and also Blair, there's a famous quote from Blair in '98. He said he's caught in this private jet with a bunch of bankers, and he's caught on a soft mic, basically said I'm so much more comfortable here than with the bloody TUC.
But they weren't strong at that point anymore, so it's actually not the legitimate test. The test would be, would he have been able to say that and keep his job
Right,
if they were still strong? Exactly.
Yeah, no,
I mean, the observables are indistinguishable.
I know, absolutely. But I come back to you, but the correlation is not causation. Simply because the trend is going down doesn't mean it's causation.
Right. But non-correlation is also not
So
causation.
now we'll just arm wrestle to settle the whole thing, right?
Exactly.
There's an argument to be made. I mean, these things are correlated, right? But there's an argument to be made that one of the things that third way politics does, if you look at it historically now, is it accelerates the decline of the union movement, right? So it's very difficult to disentangle those, the sort of.
Completely agree.
Patrick, the last word.
Yeah, no, this is a great discussion. Two cases that might fit your story really nice are India and South Africa, because at this moment, the TFEs, so, in South Africa at the time of the transition, the strongest organized group is labor. Mm-hmm. And Cyril Ramaphosa and a whole bunch of ministers are all labor guys, and they're super organized, et cetera. But Trevor Manuel becomes the finance minister. Mm-hmm. And then Mbeki, who I think had a master's degree in comp lit, becomes an overnight neoliberal. Mm-hmm. And Patrick Baum's written about this with the impact of the World Bank and the globalization of economic knowledge. And similarly in India, when Manmohan Singh becomes prime minister, he becomes prime minister with the support of the communist parties and this large-scale labor mobilization. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, it's the neoliberal moment. And he's trained by Bhagwati, the ultimate neoliberal, who's got the textbook on how to do the reforms, and they push it through. So now those are really different cases where domestic configurations maybe aren't as important as global networking and dependence on the international financial markets, et cetera. But that would be maybe a very cleaner example of where economic expertise in itself, independently of local configurations, has this huge impact on policy making.
Have you read Cornel Band's book? Rolling Ideas. So he does a comparison all the time of Spain and Romania. And he actually makes a very similar, I didn't really think he made a similar argument until Patrick just phrased it this way, but he's got this brilliant bit whereby what happens in Romania is you have these heterodox economists that are trained in Cambridge by the last of the Keynesians. Right? They were allowed to go there and work with Joan Robinson, essentially. And they hang out and they hold out against the IMF throughout the whole 1990s. And they can't get them out of power. So what they do is they go to the Atlas network and get all these crazy Romanian expats and send them to the Vienna Institute for 6 months courses on how to be a neoliberal. And then finally there's an election that gives them the opening. They fire everyone and they bring these people in. And they basically are like, they're hyper neoliberals. So one of them goes on to become the finance minister, and the best quote in the book is from 2004, where the Romanian finance minister, in response to the IMF worrying about their credit markets overheating, said, "We've had enough of the socialist dictates of the IMF." Really, that's a pretty good example right there.
Right. Yeah, I mean, part of what I hope to accomplish with the book was to sort of recognize, with so much literature on the role of economics in neoliberal transformations, it's both correct and frustrating, right? And it's always vulnerable to this argument of, this is all, it's not all about ideas, and economists themselves will say, but no one listens to us. Yeah. I don't know why you think we're so influential. But I mean, clearly in that period they are, but part of what I wanted to do with the book was to sort of recognize that that is true, and also it was conditional on a very long set of historical processes through which any relationship at all was established between economics professions and political parties, and especially center-left parties. In other words, yes, economic ideas are very, very influential by the time you get to the end of the 20th century, but that only becomes possible because they have avenues to positions of political influence, essentially because Keynesian economics was so successful at becoming the dominant channels through which economic thinking happened in the between the 1940s and the 60s. So it's so the profession is both very, very important, but the way I try to situate it in the book is that its influence is to some extent sort of it's historically arbitrary. It can't be assumed. That you have to understand why it is that people who think in a certain way or have certain credentials are able to make their ideas effective in the political world, and those channels, the channels in democratic societies to positions of power is, one of the most important channels is through parties.
And at exactly 13:30, we will leave it on that note. Thank you very much.